Hi, welcome back to How to Be Miserable. I'm Randy Patterson, author of The Assertiveness Workbook and How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies You Already Use. So today's video is a tale of discovery and a bit of undiscovery as well. And it starts with the work of Vittorio Erspamer. Wait, that sounds German. He was Italian. Vittorio Erspamer. Now that sounds Swedish. Anyway, he was born in 1909, and Erspamer is one of those people who are guaranteed to give the rest of us an inferiority complex. In 1934, at just 25 years old, he was nearing the completion of his training in medicine. And hey, why not? He was doing basic research at the same time. Clearly, this was before Netflix. He was looking at enterochromaffin cells, which you don't even know you have, but you do. They're part of the lining of your digestive tract, and they'd been discovered by a Russian named Nikolai Kolchitsky, so they're sometimes called Kolchitsky cells, which is also interesting because even though this guy never met you, he got to name a part of you that even you don't know is there. Anyway, so these cells act on the smooth muscles of the gut and they affect peristalsis, which is the squeezing that keeps things moving. So they're partly responsible for you knowing when to poop and to help you do it. So where's the psychology? It's coming. Don't rush me. So in 1934, at 25 years old, Erspamer identifies the chemical responsible for causing gut tissue contractions, and it's an amine. So he calls it enteramine. Entero refers to the intestine. Don't bother remembering it. The name doesn't last long. 14 years later, in 1948, a team of 3 people, Maurice Rapport, Arda Green, a female scientist in the 1940s, yay for that, and Irvine Page in Cleveland, because, Cleveland, what else are you going to do? No Netflix. They're working on the vascular system. By then it's known that veins and arteries don't just sit there like pipelines or, hospital administrators. They get wider at times and narrower at times. How? Well, these 3 isolated an amine that turned out to be responsible, and they called it blood clencher. Sero for blood, think serum, serology, words like that. Serum, just while we're here, comes from the Latin for whey, which is the watery part that's left over when milk has been left too long and turns into chunks. And then tonin, which is an album by Manhattan Transfer. But it also means something that squeezes or clenches. So blood clencher, serotonin. And then in 1952, it's figured out that serotonin and enteramine are exactly the same thing. So Erspamer loses the coin toss and serotonin takes over as the name. And purists call it by its chemical name, which is 5-hydroxytryptamine. There's that amine name again. Along comes Betty Twerog, another biochemist. She gets into the picture. Now, she finds that serotonin is functioning as a neurotransmitter in muscles. Not these muscles, these muscles. And she believed that chemicals that work as neurotransmitters in invertebrate animals, like mussels, would probably do the same in mammals, like us. Now, she worked for Irvine Page in Cleveland, who didn't believe that serotonin would ever be found in the brain. Then she found it, making him look like an idiot. But as usual, his name got on the paper alongside hers. So anyway, now we know that serotonin exists throughout the body. But we mainly hear about it today with regard to the brain, even though only about 5% of the serotonin in your body is actually in the brain. The other 95% is outside the central nervous system. Serotonin is often talked about in conjunction with depression, and there's a reason for this. It's one of a class of neurotransmitters that we call monoamines. Mono, because there's one, and amine, meaning amino group, NH2. The most commonly known monoamines are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. In the 1950s, people being treated with reserpine for high blood pressure would sometimes become depressed. And it was known that reserpine tends to deplete these monoamines. So hang on, it was thought. If depleting the monoamines results in depression, then maybe when depression occurs naturally, it's because people have low levels of those monoamines. And if low serotonin or low norepinephrine causes depression, then maybe we can cure depression by finding a drug that either raises the level of serotonin or norepinephrine, or both, or that makes the body make better use of however much serotonin or norepinephrine it already has. And that, in effect, is the monoamine hypothesis of depression. You know, there's just one little problem with it. It all rests on this fact that reserpine reliably causes depression. It turns out it doesn't. This whole thing was based on a mistaken idea. Still, it's an idea, and the monoamine hypothesis is still a great hypothesis. And what is it that makes for a great hypothesis? Huh? No, not that it's true, but it's testable. If you say that invisible aliens are observing us from Alpha Centauri, that's a lousy hypothesis because we have no way of testing it, at least not currently. But this idea that depression is caused by monoamine depletion, that we can test. And guess what? We have. And guess what? It's not true. Researchers have looked at serotonin levels of people who have depression and people who do not. No difference. Researchers have fed people diets that are guaranteed to cause monoamine depletion. They should get depressed. They don't. They have fed depressed people diets that are very high in the building blocks for serotonin and the other monoamines. Do they get better? Not as far as we can tell. But we've got a bunch of medications for depression. Now you might think those are thought to work by increasing the production of serotonin or norepinephrine or maybe dopamine. They don't do that. The belief has been that these medications work by making the brain or helping the brain make better use of however much serotonin or norepinephrine or dopamine is already there. Now, this is a bit complicated. Neurotransmitters work in the gap between nerve cells or neurons. A signal comes down one neuron and arrives at this gap. Serotonin, or another neurotransmitter, gets dumped into the gap. Some of it manages to get all the way across and dock on the next neuron, and if enough of it does that, the next neuron fires. Then, to avoid having to manufacture all that serotonin all over again, which is just dumped into the gap, right? The sending neuron, this one, takes some of it back. This is called re-uptake. where the sending neuron takes back some of the neurotransmitter that it just released. Most antidepressants are thought to be reuptake inhibitors. So they, in effect, they close the gates and say, nope, stay out there. Either swim across or drown, we don't care, but you are not coming back. You've probably heard of SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Reuptake inhibitor. No, you're not coming back. We know what that is. Selective, meaning that it operates mainly or exclusively in serotonin systems. Other antidepressants are SNRIs, right? Serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which operate on both serotonin and norepinephrine systems. By keeping more of the neurotransmitter in the gap and not taking it back right away, it's more likely that the next neuron will fire. So they encourage synaptic transmission. And the idea is that this is what gives it an antidepressant effect. So the theory goes, at any rate. Now you can imagine a way we might test that theory. What if we had a drug that wasn't a serotonin reuptake inhibitor? What if we had one that was a serotonin reuptake enhancer that caused the sending neuron to gobble back up serotonin even faster than it normally does, and thus inhibiting synaptic transmission rather than encouraging it? Now, you would think that would be a great test. Well, it turns out we do have such a drug. We do have a selective serotonin reuptake enhancer instead of inhibitor. It's called tianeptine. It is a serotonin reuptake enhancer, and luckily it's already out there. It's already in use in Europe. You might think, my God, what do people want that drug for? Well, it's sold as an antidepressant. Comparisons suggest that it's about as effective as reuptake inhibitors, but it's doing exactly the opposite thing. So we have two drugs. One prevents reuptake, the other promotes it, and they look like they have similar impacts on depression. That's a bit odd. Now, we might want a few more studies to nail that down, but it looks like that's what's happening. There's a fair number of studies actually comparing the two. So what's going on here? Well, listen, my goal with this video has been to tell you a little bit about the history of blood clencher, right? Serotonin, not to go over the entire controversy about antidepressants and how they work. Suffice to say that many people working in the area have concluded that our traditional thinking about how SSRIs and SNRIs work may not be correct. They may not be quite so selective after all, and it's possible they have different impacts on completely different neurotransmitter systems. Now, somebody might get all worked up about that. How dare you use medications you don't really understand? Well, I don't use them. I'm a psychologist. I don't prescribe. But, how dare anybody do that? Listen, that's not actually a significant problem. It's been happening for years. Every single folk remedy in history has been like this. If it works, some story gets made up about it, and the story is something like, Zeus gave us this flower with the power to cure hiccups. It doesn't cure hiccups because Zeus did something. That's not it, right? We often do not know the mechanism by which a substance produces an effect. But with careful science, we can evaluate whether it does produce that effect, however it comes out. One of the best examples of this is probably in your house. Aspirin. Aspirin works. It has some downsides, like every medication that exists, But aspirin works. And for decades it was used before anyone had the slightest idea why it worked. You probably know that there's a debate about how effective antidepressants really are. Personally, I suspect they're quite helpful over and above any placebo effect for a number of people, but also not so great for many other people. The problem is we can't really figure out who's likely to be a good responder and who isn't. Maybe someday we'll figure that out. And it's possible that any chemical effect operates in some complicated way through its action on a chemical discovered by Vittorio Erspamer in the gut in 1934. Enteroamine, 5-hydroxytryptamine, serotonin, blood clencher. If you like videos like this, consider subscribing by pressing the button below. And if you're interested in more ideas about how people make their lives worse or potentially make them better, consider looking at my book, How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies You Already Use. See you again.